The other one, the other disorder is not genetic, it's autoimmune. And you've probably heard of it before. Have you guys heard of vitiligo before? Vitiligo is a patchy loss of pigmentation because your immune system makes a mistake and starts to destroy your melanocytes in regions. Okay? And so, depending on your inherent skin color, your baseline skin color, it can either be really noticeable, right, if you have inherently dark skin, or not very noticeable if you have inherently light skin. And it's autoimmune, so we don't have a cure for it, and it tends to like go in stages in which it's really active, and then it'll go away and leave that area alone, and the melanocytes will go through cell division, and then you'll regain some pigmentation. But as long as you have it, you have to protect your skin from UV radiation in any area that they're not doing their own protection. So this little girl has vitiligo and inherently dark skin. But just so you know, so does this freaking gorgeous goddess. That's Winnie something. I can't remember her name. She's a Winnie Harlow. Oh yeah, Winnie Harlow. She is a model, and she's would have been beautiful with it or without it. So she's got vitiligo, and it's interesting because in her it's pretty symmetrical, the way that it actually hit. I don't know what that is about, and I don't know if it's generally symmetrical. But that's vitiligo. There's no cure for it. That's what Michael Jackson said bleached his skin. But it doesn't do it like that. So it might have been what happened initially, right? And then he may have had a whole bunch of bleaching treatments to like, you know, to, South Korea. They do a lot of bleaching treatments in South Korea, don't they? Right? Skin bleaching? Yeah? What? Oh, yeah. South Korea. So, yeah, I've been to South Korea once. If you want to know something about skincare, that country, people spend more money on skincare in that country than anywhere else in the world. And they do a bunch of bleaching treatments in South Korea. Isn't that true? Right? Yeah, that's just the most gorgeous skin you will ever see anywhere on the planet is South Korean women. But they probably also paid half of their paycheck for it. So expensive. So that's vitiligo and albinism. So I want to talk a little bit about pigmented moles and melanoma now. Okay, so the second kind of cancer that we're going to run into is melanoma, and melanoma is the biggie. Melanoma is the type of skin cancer that is the most likely to kill you. Even though it accounts for only 5% of skin cancers, it accounts for the vast majority, I think above 80% of skin cancer deaths. And that is because it's really, really aggressive about metastasis once it gets started, and it's pretty fast to metastasize. So again, I'll show you the picture that your textbook shows you. That looks like a freaking booger scab. You don't want, like, that's late stage. But in the early stages, it might look like this, okay? So, and it doesn't even have to be very big. So let's talk about melanoma. So typically speaking, when you're looking and worried about melanoma, you're going to be especially focusing on like places that you have moles. And the reason is just because you know that there's more melanocytes there, right? Right? So the stats are just toward this place. Every single time I go to the dermatologist, they like take another picture of this one. It's been there since I was 7, and it's pretty stable, but and it's how I learned my left and right. I was really sad that I didn't have them on my feet. Like I need to do. I'm still not very good at left and right. So moles do not cause melanoma, but there are more melanocytes wherever you have a mole. Yes? So you're going to watch those. All of the types of skin cancers have a genetic predisposition. So if you have them in your family, then you keep a better eye on your body because you know that they're in your family, right? Does that make sense? So melanomas in the early stages have some real characteristics that are easy to remember. Here are several different melanomas. And the way that you remember what melanomas look like is A, B, C, D. A is they tend to be asymmetrical. Do you see that? Most of them are asymmetrical. B is they tend to have irregular borders. Do you see irregular borders? C is they tend to have color variation within it. Do you see that most of them have different pigments, different shades, right? And D is diameter. As they get bigger, they are more likely to be a melanoma, right? So if they are changing and changing color, right? Does that make sense? So these are why you want to do mole checks, right? And since it's Valentine's Day, right? If you have a willing, enthusiastic participant, you can go home and do that kind of love, right? Sweetheart, I love you. Let's do a mole check. might turn into something more fun, right? It might. And then you also might save them from cancer, because you know it's really hard to break in a new spouse. You don't want to have to do that. So this is melanoma. Melanoma is a big deal. It metastasizes really quickly. It likes to metastasize to your lungs and your brain. And super duper quickly. So you always want to keep a really good eye on these. I do have like a story about a friend of mine who had melanoma to illustrate how serious this was. So it's a survival story. I knew her when she was in her 40s, and the story is from when she was in her 20s, but just to illustrate how serious this is. So when she was in her 20s, she was from Texas, but she was going to school in New York. And every time she flew home, her mom would say, you know that little spot that's right there over your clavicle? You should probably get that checked. It looks a little weird. And she did what you would do, right? Fly back to New York, right? And then she came back home the second time, right? And her mom's like, I think it looks a little different than it did the last time. You totally need to get that checked. Fly back to New York, right? Third time she came home, her mom said, guess what? I made you a dermatologist appointment, and it's right now. Picked her up from the airport and took her to the dermatologist right now. That's some good mama right there. And she didn't actually leave the dermatologist's office. They actually admitted her straight into the hospital and scheduled her surgery. It was diagnosed as a melanoma. They were really afraid that it had metastasized to her brain because she had some strange looking spots on her scan in her brain. So this is what they chose to do. She had chemotherapy and radiation after she had this surgery. They took all of her skin and also her lymphatic vessels from here to about the manubrium of her sternum. They took all of it there. And she had to have skin grafts, right? And they gave her 2 years to live. And the size of the melanoma was, she says, about half the diameter of your pinky on the bottom. So these are like really, really serious. And once they figured out it was melanoma, they thought it was like definitely going to kill her. And she didn't. She was one of the few people. But she did wear huge floppy hats and long gloves for the rest of her life. It was great. She just looked like a Southern lady, and she was a Southern lady. So, but she survived, and she's still alive. That's Pam. So that's melanoma. That one's a really, really big deal. Okay, so, and then we'll talk about our last cancer, and then I'll talk about where cancers occur. Okay, so the next layer up, after we leave the basal layer is the one with the most information, is this layer from here until it gets pigmented. And it's variable in thickness, right? Okay, the cells are still undergoing cell division. They do slow down a little, but they're still undergoing cell division. And do you see how some of them have gotten kind of pointy? Do you see that? Okay, so for that reason, sometimes they call these cells prickle cells, or they call it the stratum spinosum, as in spiny. Yeah? Does that make sense?
Little lines on it?
Well, no, how this one is like just columnar looking, and this one looks like it has points on it. Do you see that? Okay. Yeah, the lines are supposed to be desmosomes. That's what they're trying to represent. So some of them kind of get kind of pointy looking. So this layer is variable in thickness. And there's one type of cell here for the first time that you're going to meet for the first time. This is called an epidermal dendritic cell. This epidermal dendritic cell is the most superficial layer of your immune system that you have. It's also sometimes called a Langerhans cell. Somebody asked about this last time. So this is an immune cell. It's the most superficial immune cell that you have. This is the one that gets really, really pissed off when you have eczema. Okay? So what happens when you have eczema is for a couple of different reasons. It could be because of allergies. Sometimes eczema is because of different if you eat different things, it can give you eczema. Sometimes it's because you actually have an emotional response. Whatever you did can turn on this little booger, and it can start the inflammatory response, and it actually attracts a bunch of its white blood cells, and inflammatory, it can even be like pussy, right? And this is usually not because there's actually a pathogen, but because your skin is irritated in the absence of a pathogen. And eczema tends to be chronic, right? You tend to have it, it goes away, you do something slightly different, it comes back, it goes away. It's really just an immune system massive response that tends to be repetitive. Go ahead. It's not autoimmune because it doesn't actually damage any tissues, right? It's just like hyperactive immune. Yeah? Does that make sense? So it's not actually like trashing anything particularly. It's just like, hey, I'm really pissed off. And then you calm it down. It's like, I'm still pissed, over and over again, right? And that's what happens. And it does tend to have a genetic predisposition, but not like you don't inherit it, right? So if like your parents had eczema, you're slightly more likely to. But if you could sometimes even changing climate will make it go away. Changing your diet will make it go away. Sometimes if you're no longer emotionally stressed, it'll go away and then it'll come back again. So it's basically, go ahead. Oh, that's just, these guys haven't calmed down yet from the whole birth process. It will happen. Cradle cap is kind of related to this as well, but it'll go away, right? It's just like your skin is like, hey, look at the world, ah! And then it, right? Because it didn't really have to deal with world stuff before, right? So it'll calm down. That tends to go away in kids. And cradle cap doesn't even make it more likely that you're going to have eczema as an adult or even later. It's not, no relationship has really been shown between the two of them. Okay, so those are the epidermal dendritic cells. Now let's talk about the last type of cancer, and then we'll talk about where cancer occurs. So the last type of cancer is called squamous cell carcinoma. The cells aren't squamous yet, but it's called that. It occurs in this layer, which is the stratum spinosum. This is late stage. Again, just looks super weird. Early stage, though, you might not actually get it treated because it kind of looks like you pulled off a scab too soon. Doesn't it? Yeah? And it just isn't healing and kind of stays that way for a really long time. This one is intermediate in severity. All of them can kill you. The one that's most likely to kill you is this one. The one that's least likely is this one. And this one's intermediate, right? So if you can catch it in the early stages before it moves, then you can usually get a pretty good likelihood of curing. But once it metastasizes, it becomes pretty aggressive. So this is squamous cell carcinoma. That's early stage. This is late stage squamous cell carcinoma. And it does metastasize, but not quite as quickly as the other one. So now let's talk about all three types of skin cancer, where you get them, and whether tanning actually doesn't cause skin cancer, right? So where you get them is culturally specific, right? And it's also different between the sexes, right? So since I'm from Texas, does it surprise you at all that it's slightly different? In Texas, people were more likely, especially women, were more likely to get skin cancers on their legs, on their shoulders, and on their cleavage than they are here. Why is that? Is this dramatically different genetically? No. It's culturally, right? We're more culturally conservative here. And women tend to be a little more covered, right? It was so predisposed to like uncovering everything that when I taught anatomy in Texas, I literally sometimes had to tell certain women in my classes, I was like, hey, I need you to wear shorts that are at least this long, because if you bend over the cadaver, I don't want to be studying your anatomy. That's what I'm telling you, right? You need to like tuck that stuff in because it's distracting, even to me. I'm not particularly interested, but I'm seeing up your pants. Depending on the culture, right, you can have it in different places. From your culture, you're probably not going to get it on your neck, correct? Right, probably not. Just, I mean, you could, because cancer's a jerk, right? But here, women tend to, it's a little more narrow. Women, by the way, we should all be protecting this more than we are. Even if your neckline goes up to here, this will tell your age, even when you made this lie. And your hands will also tell your age, don't they? Don't you wish you could go back, ladies, and put some sunscreen on? Talk about sunscreen in just a minute. So with men, though, again, depending on the culture, men tend to get cancer more often than women on the backs of their necks, the backs of their ears, yeah, and their face. Why do women tend to get fewer cancers on their face than men? Yeah, so let's just do an informal poll. Oh, there's only 2 dudes here. Sorry, guys. Women, how many of you do either wear makeup or something to protect your skin from the sun, by show of hands? Right? How many of us do, right? And how many of you dudes? Okay, it's almost always that way. Almost always that way. Because we tend to be relatively vain about our facial appearance, and we're not really trying to protect against cancer. We're trying to protect against ugly, right? And then the cancer thing just comes with it, right? But dudes are pretty sure, my husband is pretty sure he's never going to be ugly. It's not even a possibility for him. He wakes up in the morning and goes, and then walks out the door. I wake up in the morning, I'm like, what the hell? 25 minutes later, I'm still like, all right, whatever. I go out the door, right? But I did convince him to start wearing sunscreen primarily because I said, I do not want to wipe your butt in the future because you got some preventable cancer, right? I don't want to do that. You need to take care of all that. You can put some stuff on. He's like, fine. So it's different in different locations. Typically speaking, though, here's an interesting one for women. The one that tends to metastasize most in women is when they get cancers on the backs of their legs. Why is that? Do you look back there every now and then? After you're like 20, do you want to look back there every now and then? You're like, no, it's probably still there. It's fine. Just pretend that everything's good back there, right? So the problem is that we don't tend to pay very close attention to what's going on back there. So men get them all over, and as they start to bald, they also get them on the tops of their heads, and you've seen that, right? Okay, so we should all be wearing more sunscreen here and here, right? All over the place. All right, so now we are going to move up to the stratum granulosum. Where are we? Okay, so once you move up, do you see how it kind of gets grainy and darker right here? So this was basale. From here to here, regardless of the thickness, is spinosum. And then this is granulosum. So look at granulosum in an actual histology slide. You can totally see where it starts being pigmented. What happens is there is a precursor to keratin that stains when you stain this. It's called keratohyalin. Keratin doesn't stain, otherwise this would be dark, right? But this one stains. So you can see the precursor when you use a protein staining technique to keratin. So that's called the stratum granulosum. Really, all they're doing is boatloads of protein synthesis at that point, making a whole bunch of keratin because you are about to take one for the team and die. Yes? And then the next thing that happens is this layer right here, whoops, this layer right here gets clear right before all of them are really dead. But just so you know, if the skin is thin skin, you can't see the clear layer very much. So let's look at the difference between thin and thick skin. They always say it doesn't occur in thin skin. It's not really true. So do you see the granulosum layer? And do you see the lucidum layer? And lucid means clear, right? So you can only really label that in thick skin. But what's happening in the lucidum layer is that pretty much all of the organelles are dying off. We just got a bag of cytoplasm and keratin. Yeah? Because they're almost done. Okay? And then, so you have one theoretically here, because there have to be dead cells, right? There have to be a bag of cells, but you can't label it because it's probably only one cell thick, right? Okay? So you only label the lucidum on the thick skin. And then the top layer is the stratum corneum. And the stratum corneum is corn as in unicorn, as in horn, the same keratin that makes skin, hair, nails, claws, unicorn horns if it were a thing, rhino horns because they are, right? Scales, right? All of this is made of this, which is keratin. So this is the stratum corneum. And depending on whether you're thin skin or thick skin, it's dramatically different in thickness, right? If you're in thick skin, it makes up maybe 3/4 of the epidermis, right? But the dermis is still way thicker. In thin skin, it doesn't make up much of it at all, right? So that's the stratum corneum. Everybody good? So that's the whole way up. Okay, questions? Okay, so if you damage this before, so if you got a sunburn and it damaged all the way down to your stratum basale, what happens is you kill off those cells and your body tries to regenerate and it pushes the cells up really, really quickly, right? Because you know after you get a sunburn, you're not going to peel for, I don't know, 3 days, 4 days, something like that. I don't know how long it takes. But you kill them all off and then your body goes, we need to trash that, and it moves them up to the top really quickly and then you just peel them off. Good? Okay. So questions, epidermis? Everybody good? Okay. So now we are going to move to the dermis. Okay. The dermis is a heck of a lot thicker than the epidermis, and there's some interesting stuff that's going on down there. Okay, where are you, epidermis or dermis? Okay, so we just did this. Please remember that the epidermis doesn't have any direct blood flow, right? And only the very, very bottom layer has any innervation at all, right? So keep that in mind. So that means that the dermis is going to be super vascular because it's going to nourish the epidermis by diffusion, right? Remember, the oxygen and nutrients are going to diffuse up, right? And the carbon dioxide and waste products are going to diffuse down. Does that make sense? Okay, so that is, it nourishes the epidermis by diffusion. And then basically we have two layers. They don't look any different in this picture, but I'll go ahead and tell you that the more superficial layer of the dermis is made of areolar connective tissue. That's called the papillary layer. And then the deeper layer is made of dense irregular connective tissue, and they're kind of continuous with one another. They like just change into the other one. So let me show you that one up close and show you what the papillary layer, why the papillary layer is called the papillary layer. Okay, so the papillary layer is called the papillary layer because the way that it attaches to the dermis leaves these papillae. And you are going to run into papillae all semester long because papilla means nipple. And every damn thing they found, those monks, every time those monks found something that was vaguely boob or nipple or vagina related, they named something after it. So you are literally going to have a skin nipple, a kidney nipple, a brain boob, right? You are going to have a heart nipple, right? Everything is named after nipples and boobs. It's just really awkward for all of us, but it's true, right? They're like, I'm pretty sure that's what it looks like. Don't you think? Is that what it looks like? And then you just name something else out. So these are your dermal papillae. And this is sort of the rough way that the dermis meets the epidermis. So those are dermal papillae. We're going to come back to those in just a second. The dermis is highly vascular, and not only does it have a lot of blood in it, but it's got a whole bunch of white blood cells in it. So if something got deep to the epidermis, hopefully it would get whooped up on by the dermis, right? There's a whole bunch of white blood cells in there. There are a whole bunch of nerve fibers in there, and erector pili muscles are in there. So all of this yellow stuff is nerve fibers. This is just two different kinds of sensory receptors. Nerve fibers are in there. Your useless erector pili muscles are in there, right? They're still in there. And you've also got lymphatic vessels in here. You guys might not know what lymphatic vessels are. If you have excess fluid that drains into a tissue, the lymphatic vessels can drain it back out of the tissue. They're not showing any in here, but we'll hopefully get to lymphatic system this semester. Okay, now what happens is in some places, the curves of the dermis, the top of the dermis, are so dramatic that the epidermis follows it. Does that make sense? And those make dermal ridges, okay, which are also called fingerprints and footprints, okay? Evolutionarily, what do you think is the advantage to fingerprints and footprints? What does it do? Grip, yeah, right? It gives you some grip because without fingerprints or footprints, it's like walking on the ice in your church shoes, right? Instead of in your hiking shoes, right? You're gonna end up on your butt. You know you are, right? So if you have a little grip, then it makes it easier to hold on to these things, right? So these are kind of genetically inherited, and there's a whole bunch of fingerprint patterns, and it's kind of cool to study. And my fingerprints are going to be more similar to my son's than mine would be to you. That should make sense, right? So if you're more closely related, your fingerprints are more similar. Interestingly, though, even identical twins do not have identical fingerprints. They have identical DNA fingerprints, right? Does anybody have an identical twin? No? They're not that common. Every once in a while I get one, and I always ask them to get fingerprints of both of them and give them to me because I'm a total creep, but then they do it anyway. Like, will you please give them? And they're like, fine. So their fingerprints are not identical. They're super duper similar, but one of the things that we figured out is that your fingerprints are kind of set down by genetics, but then they're environmentally influenced by how you're like holding your hands or touching the side of the womb during development. Mm-hmm. So if like one of them was doing this during development, then their fingerprints would be slightly different than the one whose hands were out and against the side of the womb, even though they were like roommates, right? They're hanging out, right? So their fingerprints are super duper similar, but you can always tell a little difference between the two of them, which is great. It means that that person's not really going to be the alibi that you thought. So don't be a murderer, because you won't be able to tell the difference between DNA or fingerprints, but between actual fingerprints you will. So that's fingerprints and footprints. Then we'll do tattoos next time. You guys want to hear a gross story? Yeah? Of course you do. Okay, ready? I looked this up because I thought, well, because I'm a weirdo. I'm going to teach you this. I'm not going to test you on this name. I won't. but it's kind of cool. Anthropodermic bibliopedy is the fact that humans figured out a while ago that you could actually make leather from the dermis of other mammals, yes? Leather from the dermis of other mammals, yeah? That's what leather is. It's just stretched and moisturized and tanned. So it's nice and flexible and still really strong. So it extends your regular connective tissue. Well, at some point we figured out that you could probably make leather from other people. And then they have. And sometimes they decided maybe I'm going to use it to make a book, and which is Anthropodermic Biblio. Yes? So this one's in Harvard. So this one's kind of an interesting story. This book is a whole book about virginity. Would you think that would only need a page? It's not that freaking complicated, is it? Right? Whole damn book about virginity that a doctor decided to cover in the skin of one of his maidens who died. One of his patients who died. He covered it in her skin. I'm not quite sure how that was appropriate, but it is. This one's at Harvard, if you want to go visit it. One of these I visited last summer when I went to the UK. This one is in London at the Wellcome Museum, I think. Actually, the top one's at the Wellcome. No, that one's at Harvard. This one's at the Wellcome Museum. This one is a book about spirituality that a doctor covered in the skin of a deceased mental patient. She was also a woman. There's probably a theme here. Spirituality. And then this one is the one that's really an interesting story and also super duper weird. This one is in London. This one is in Edinburgh, Scotland. This one's the one that's a super interesting story. This one is covered in the skin of this guy named Burke. I don't remember if it's John or William Burke. John. Burke. Burke was not a cool dude. Burke actually wanted to help med schools get cadavers for dissection. They didn't quite want to wait until the people died. So he actually killed 15 different people and sold their corpses to med schools for dissection. When they caught him, this is all true, and it's very Valentine-y, isn't it? Super romantic. When they caught him, they executed him by a public hanging, and then they did a public dissection. And then somebody took a piece of the skin and made a book out of it.
Cool.
Yeah. And this one's in Edinburgh, Scotland. And I didn't know. I was in Edinburgh last summer and I didn't go see it. I totally would have. So this is called Anthropodermic bibliopedy, which is this weird practice. There's like 10 or 12 of these books that have been confirmed around the world that are actually covered in human skin. These people are weird. Go ahead.
Have you heard of the people who want to save tattoos of loved ones who passed? Hang them on their wall?
No, I'm not at all surprised, but do you know something about that?
I haven't met anyone that's done it, but I'll look into it.
Okay, so I want to tell you one. Let's talk about tattoos, since she was talking about tattoos. And this will be the last thing for today. I'm going to show you that picture. Let me pull up another picture of tattoo just to show you where it actually goes. Just wait right there.
You know the Nazis made lampshades out of it.
Yeah, they totally did.
You think that's the same thickness, or is that kind of leather?
Yeah, They made a bunch of different things out of it. There's a whole area of study that's like Nazi medicine, like what came out of the whole. Okay, so you guys know what tattoos look like. You've been around for a while, right? So how do tattoos actually work? Well, obviously it has to go deeper than the epidermis. Otherwise, that would be of a really expensive month, wouldn't it? Right? Okay. But henna tattoos, anybody ever had henna tattoos done? Okay. Henna tattoos are just really a dye or a pigment that just lays in the epidermis. And so when you slough off your epidermis, you lose it, right? Okay. And depending on how good the pigment is and how well you let it sit, it can last anywhere. You know, if you get it on the beach in Cabo, it's going to last like a day. They're going to tell you it's going to last a week, but it's going to last a day. But these guys, what they actually do is they inject a pigment, tiny, tiny needles, deep so that it actually goes to the dermis. And then what the immune system does is it actually sequesters the dye, right? It actually sequesters the dye to hold it in place, and its immune system responds. They need to use a dye that will not cause a massive inflammatory reaction, but the immune system kind of localizes it and holds it right there. Does that make sense? So it holds it right there and it stays relatively stationary. And now, over time, of course, tattoos have been around for thousands of years, right? But over time, the modern mechanisms are making tattoos that the pigment is really, really stable with UV radiation. UV radiation does tend to break them down. You've got a whole bunch of different bright pigments, far less likely to cause any immune system reaction, right? And they last a lot longer than they used to. But basically, you just injected it and then your immune system kind of held it right there. That's what's going on with tattoos. So, and those are really culturally significant, right? You've got entire like populations in the South Pacific in which the tattoos are completely indicative of not just culture, but also status within a culture, right? And so historically speaking, these have been really significant. And you've got everything from like really bright, beautiful tattoos to like prison tattoos, right? And prison tattoos are like culturally significant within that culture, right? That makes sense? Okay, so we'll stop there for today, and I will see you guys on Tuesday.
The ones I think are interesting, like those tribes where they like cut into you with sap.
Oh, scarification, yeah. I always kind of wondered, since that's a really, really old ritual, and it exists in some African cultures, and I think it's in some Australian cultures, and then some Asian cultures as well. I always wondered, long before they got to the point that we knew anything about like aseptic practices, was there a lot of infection associated with scarification?
I think they actually did something about. I can't remember.
I wonder what they did.
But I actually have a couple of South Sudanese friends